I want to know ultimately. I mean, ultimately, I want to know why you find value in, we'll use the odious 21st century term, platforming someone who is completely delusional. What we heard in that video, what we hear in videos like it, we're not targeting just one person, is complete delusion, complete disconnect with reality. And not only personal delusion, like someone who believes that, there's life on alien planets, but falsifiable delusion, the things that can be demonstrated to be untrue. 15 minutes, the two of you went on about how modern medicine has never done anything for anybody. What value do you find in platforming people like that? Talking to them, maybe not, privately, because Ellie seems like someone who'd be interesting to talk to. Mm-hmm. And some of the other absolute raving, delusional lunatics that you had on your channel also seem, paradoxically, like they might be interesting to talk to privately. But when you put that out on YouTube, aren't you encouraging people to think, oh, this guy might be right? When you knew the whole time you were talking that nothing he was saying was right. Nothing. Not one single claim was right.
All right. I'm here with Steve Donoghue. As many of my viewers have been pestering me and harassing me, when am I going to have another conversation with Steve Donoghue? The answer is finally now. So, Steve, it's wonderful to see you. It's been too long. I always enjoy our conversations together. Thanks so much for talking to me. How are you?
It has been too long. I'm just fine. And I want everybody to know that this Zoom chat is, I consider, a consolation prize. What really the real form this should take is you and me doing this live
in person.
Yeah, and calzone in person.
Of course. So the audience will have to wait for that, but that will be on the horizon. Anyway, Steve, you had thoughts about the interview I did with a friend of mine, Ellie Weber. It's not the first time I've spoken to a conspiracy theorist on my channel, and I don't think who knows? It might be the last, but it might not be the last. Unclear. So I'm curious what your thoughts are as someone whose guidance and mentorship I've always appreciated. What do you make of those conversations and what I'm trying to do there?
The main thought I had at first was meta. I admit, before I started being outraged, my main thought was meta, which is how canny it was for you to choose Ellie in order to say the kinds of things you knew he was going to say. You know plenty of people who would have said those kinds of things and wouldn't have given the deeply conflicted reaction that I'm sure everyone who watched that video had. I had it myself. Ellie is an obviously really nice guy. I don't know him at all, and I feel absolutely certain that if I asked him for his last $10 because I really needed it, he would give it to me without hesitation. And every person who watched that video thought the same thing. This is a really nice guy. That was canny on your part. You have a real skill for this sort of thing. For I won't even say booking guests, because that's too low a skill. You have a really good skill at talking to them as well. That was my main thought. My main thought was meta, which is that it's a shame that this is not something you do professionally.
Oh, that's sweet.
It was really well done, except for all the parts of it that weren't well done. And they led to a lot of questions. They led to a lot of outrage on my part, because South Boston Irish Catholic, I would imagine that most people who watched that video just felt sad. You seemed very sad yourself. Often, in the course of the interview, you seemed very sad. And I don't think it's much of a mysterious elephant in the room to know why. But for me, again, whether it's Southie, D Street represent, or whether it's, I don't know what it is, but it did not make me feel anything as Christian as sadness. It made me feel infuriated. Had to resist the urge to leave, a standard old man yells at clouds, all cap comment. I had to resist the urge to do that. Instead, I reached out to you. I have many, many questions about
that. Explain your anger. What particularly provoked your ire?
Nothing that he said was true. Literally no fact, claim, or observation that he made was true. And worse, all of them, not 90%, which would be bad enough, all of them were demonstrably untrue. And you just kept asking him questions.
How would you have liked me to respond? What would have been a good way to
you said
that?
in the video yourself that you don't debate with your guests, and that's your own choice. And I respect that. And I really like it. You're really good at what you do and doing it that way. But I have questions. I have questions for you.
So if I'm making a claim, if the roles are reversed now, and I'm making a claim like I
you name it when it comes to
9/11 was an inside job. You know, what's the 9/11 response to that?
That is where the kinds of absolute lunacy that he was spouting for an hour, where the rubber of those claims actually hits the road, is when you're talking about real people. I watched the second plane go into the second tower, and it was not a hologram. And his response is built in. He has built in a get out of jail free card in his own personal eschatology, which is that everything that would count as proof to the contrary of what he's saying is manufactured by them. He even has a them in mind. I found it so fascinating that he would completely disagree with this, I'm sure, and you would too. On the surface, it seems weird on my part to say, but what he was espousing was 100% pure anti-Semitism. Only somebody else in place of the Jews. But the words exactly the same, the claims exactly the same. You must have seen that.
Yeah.
He was talking about these reptilian aliens manipulating the media, falsifying all historical records, being in charge of all sorts of nodes of communication and cultural dissemination. That is anti-Semitism. Half the time he was saying that, and half the time he was talking about, going to Chava's room or talking about. I promised myself that I would not simply come on your channel and yell, but I want to know ultimately. Ultimately, I want to know why you find value in, we'll use the odious 21st century term, platforming someone who is completely delusional. What we heard in that video, what we hear in videos like it, we're not targeting just one person, is complete delusion, complete disconnect with reality. And not only personal delusion, like someone who believes that there's life on alien planets, but falsifiable delusion, the things that can be demonstrated to be untrue. 15 minutes the two of you went on about how modern medicine has never done anything for anybody. Demonstrably untrue. I'm here because it's not true. You're here because it's not true. He's here because it's not true. Talking about getting in a catastrophic car crash and how I was totally out of it for 2 weeks. Really? Were you in a ditch for 2 weeks? No, you weren't. You were saved by modern medicine. What value do you find in platforming people like that? Talking to them, maybe not, privately, because Ellie seems like someone who'd be interesting to talk to. Mm-hmm. And some of the other absolute raving, delusional lunatics that you had on your channel also seem, paradoxically, like they might be interesting to talk to privately. But when you put that out on YouTube, aren't you encouraging people to think, oh, this guy might be right? When you knew the whole time you were talking that nothing he was saying was right. Nothing. Not one single claim was right. Was factually, ontologically right in our shared reality. I understand why in your own rules of the game you wouldn't debate him. That's not what you called him on for. That's not what you do. But why would you do it?
Great. So that's a great question. First of all, I want to say that I'm very careful. I'm very thoughtful about this question, and I'm very careful about who I do and don't platform. And I do a lot more interviews than make it up onto the channel, because there's a lot of people that don't get published. And yeah,
you've done interviews with flat earthers.
Sure. Yeah. Multiple. Yeah.
But okay, the thing that people who like to toy around Joe Rogan style with flat Earth don't ever seem to fully realize is that it is anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Because it's demonstrably true that the earth is not flat, which means that the fact that the earth is flat would have to be promulgated to society. There would have to be some sort of vast conspiracy to suppress the information of the shape of the world. And every single time you push a flat earther, you get to the Jews doing that.
Sure.
Ever anybody else, their favorite thing to say is that it's the Freemasons.
So one of the questions I want to ask you.
I don't have any idea what that is. They got that completely from Eric Dubay, who is a raving anti-Semite.
Of course. Yeah. One of the questions I want to ask you is why it always comes back to the Jews. But before I ask you that question.
You go ahead.
Before I ask you that question, I want to talk a little bit more about this most recent interview. The answer is as follows. This is grown out of conversations that I've had in real life, because there are people in my life that I've encountered like adjacent to my life, like people that I will run into on a fairly regular basis who hold like wild conspiratorial beliefs. And I have the choice of completely cutting them out of my life, or which would be essentially the same thing, identical to debating them, right? Debating them would be the same thing as saying, like, if we talk to each other, we're going to get into a fight. Therefore, we're like probably never going to talk to each other. Or I could try to develop a technique of a kind of, coming from a place of empathy, coming from a place of curiosity, and trying to mirror what it means to like be curious about another's point of view, in the hope that long term in this interaction they will be curious about my point of view, and we could sort of share notes. There's a develop a rapport where I can be inquisitive and skeptical and ask questions about where your thinking has taken you, and together we could sort of hold up a mirror and think, like, does that really feel right? And then you could do the same to me, and we can both do that with respect. So that's sort of an approach that I've taken in my own life with real human beings, not in a recorded context. Now, there's this desire that I've had to sort of translate some of that to a recorded medium, do some of these Zoom calls with people. Now, the medicine example, I think, is a great example. Like when I go into that phone call, I'm on the waiting screen, I'm waiting for my friend to join the meeting. I'm like thinking to myself, how in God's name does someone like this reconcile the fact that he engages in modern technology, he flies in airplanes, he drives and whatever, but thinks that modern medicine is a scam? How is that possible? So I'm literally coming from a place of honest to God curiosity. Like, where are you going to draw that line? Like, where are you going to say, like, I'm talking to you on a computer over Zoom that was generated by research programs in science that was published in journals and patents and all those things. But this kind of research, this kind of progress, this kind of technology, I don't accept. That's an honest to God question that I'm coming in with, because of course, to you and me, it's obviously incoherent. And I think it is legitimately incoherent. Like, it legitimately doesn't make sense. But I want to probe that, and I want to explore that, and I want to maybe shine some light on that, and that to me is what's exciting about that conversation. And you can make the criticism, I think there's a valid criticism to be made, that I didn't go far enough, or that I didn't push it far enough, or expose it far enough. And I think that's a perfectly valid criticism that I'm, sitting with after the video's been recorded, but that's the motivation that goes into that conversation.
Okay, but have you ever known that to happen?
Well, it depends
what
you mean the goal
in your life of someone who thought, well, now that we have this rapport, I'm starting to see that some of my beliefs are insane.
I mean, it's a really hard question to answer. And first of all, you have to ask yourself, what are you comparing it to? Because I would also
it's a really hard question to answer unless you say no. The answer is no.
I'm not going to say no. I don't think the answer is no. It's these are very subtle. What'd you say?
One example. Has that ever happened?
I think I listen, these are subjective judgment calls that you can't measure or quantify. And there's certainly a lot of cognitive bias that goes into it. But I do believe I've had tempering influences on people over time. I can point to examples of someone who I think was far out and became less far out over the course of conversing with people who hold much less radical beliefs in this kind of a format. Obviously in an unrecorded offline format, not a recordings are totally separate.
So you can point to an example in your own life of someone who said, I used to believe that, but I think you're right. I was wrong about that.
It's not so clear cut. It's not so black and white, but I can point to someone who I think was like a rabid Trumper who I think over time de-radicalized to some extent, maybe 20%, like things like that. And so I don't think any one person can ever take credit for that kind of a thing. And certainly if we're comparing it to a methodology of debate, I believe that debate has a very strong backfire effect in my experience. People who, come hard with the facts and come hard with the credentials, really tend to just reinforce the beliefs they're trying to fight against.
Makes people dig in their heels.
Totally. Yeah, totally. I think a lot of what we choose to believe, what feels right, is based on a vibe, which is downstream of our interpersonal relationships. What I believe, I think, is something which often is influenced by how good I am on what good on the terms I am with other people who hold that belief versus the terms I'm on with people who don't hold that belief. I think all of us are none of us are immune from those kind of psychological influences.
But that doesn't disagree, though. Whether or not the beliefs are true.
Which, say again?
That doesn't change whether or not the beliefs are true.
Of course.
Based on true things, just because you like or dislike.
That of course is true. But I mean, at the same time, I
see a rising, absolutely drowning tide of delusional lunacy. And I ask myself, the most benevolent, friendly way possible, whether or not a video like that contributes to that rising tide, to a rising tide of not people I disagree with, oh my God, these hippies, but absolute demonstrable lunacy on either side of the culture war spectrum here in America.
Yeah.
So that you have 170 million adult Americans who believe that Trump won the 2020 election. And of those 170 million adult Americans, 60 million of them believe he is actually president. And that everything you see on the news is fake, orchestrated by him. 60 million people. You have Carrie Lake in the news just yesterday being asked, what about the rumors that Trump wants you as a vice president? And her saying, I can't serve as vice president. I'm governor of Arizona.
I'm not gonna say I don't know that I'm not contributing to that. I don't know. I'm not convinced that I'm not part of that problem. And that's why I want to have this conversation with you, to help me understand, because I don't know. To me, that's a tough question. So the question that I am interested in and the path of thinking that I go down and I want to explore with you is, well, what are the alternatives? So one alternative is to just obviously never platform. To me, that doesn't feel like, that's valid. That's reasonable. That's like a baseline. It's like a control group kind of scenario. Perfectly valid approach that most people take. To me, it feels like there should be a way to do it. In some cases, in the best case scenario, there should be a way to platform responsibly. That seems like a plausible thing. So my question then becomes, what would be a responsible form of platforming for these kind of things, if any?
If you know ahead of time for certain that every single thing your guest is going to say is not only going to be wrong, but demonstrably wrong. If you know that for certain ahead of time, and in many cases on your channel, again, we're not going to bring it down to just one person, you know for certain that you are not going to moderate their opinions in any way. You could do it for 100 years, and you wouldn't moderate a single opinion. In Ellie's case, any disagreement that you have with him, any disagreement that I have with him, he would look on with pity, because we're still sheeple trapped in the matrix. That is invulnerable. That would need professional psychological deprogramming one-on-one in hour-long sessions for probably 2 years. It's not going to happen on a Zoom call.
So you say there's no way to platform. That's your stance.
If it's someone that you disagree with, if you're calling me on ahead of time and you want to rave about how great David Foster Wallace is, well, fine, then there is a way to do that. You knew ahead of time, with the people that you platform, you know ahead of time that they are going to say absolute lunacy, and that it's demonstrable lunacy. I can demonstrate that every single claim he made in that video is false. It's not a question of me disagreeing with it. I can demonstrate that it's true, and I can also demonstrate an enormous amount of psychopathy. To say that all of historical records have been faked because they don't co-align with the science fiction idea that you've come up with. There are historical records that cannot be faked. They absolutely cannot be faked. And yet, when he hesitated in your talk about the fossil fuel industry, he was not hesitating because the fossil fuel industry is money grabbing. He was hesitating because he doesn't believe there are fossils. And I can prove that there are because they cannot possibly be faked by any technology that exists in the world. And he's given himself an out for that, because in his eschatology, there is a technology that's not of this world, and that might find it important to put an Archaeopteryx in a mine somewhere. where random chance, a cliff falls off in Dover, a cliffside falls off in France or in South America or in southern China, and reveals multi-layers of a rock bed of fossils. No one knew the cliff bed was going to fall. No one knew it was going to fall when any human was looking at it. No one knew it was going to fall when humans would look at it who had any kind of archaeological knowledge. It fell and just happened at that chance to happen. And yet, nope. You knew ahead of time. You know ahead of time that your guests, flat earthers, can't have fossils either. They absolutely can't. The model that they are using is the Old Testament creation of the world. They might say they're all about the science, but they believe in the great deep, for God's sake. They believe in Leviathan and Behemoth. They can't have fossils either. Fossils mean geological time. That can't happen in a flat earth. In other words, that cliff face that falls off and reveals multiple beds, multiple millennia of fossils cannot be faked. There is nothing that can fake it. And if you posit some otherworldly science that has all sorts of nefarious motives for humankind, well, maybe you can give in a science fiction scenario, you can give them the technology to fake it, but then you have to give them a motive to do it on something that might never have happened. But then, no, it isn't just chance. It was all carefully orchestrated. Just if you know that ahead of time, I'm wondering, is any part of your motivation for putting people on and talking to them, knowing that they are fully delusional, is any part of that a temptation on your part to sort of buy in to the delusions? Do you ever feel the undertow?
No.
So
this is, yeah, again, I see it very differently. I think it's possible to focus on the truth claims. And that's what most people do. And I think that's what most people probably see when they watch the video. But I'm interested in the epistemological work. I'm interested in the process and the mechanisms by which people end up like that. You know, how do you arrive at this worldview? Because you and I, Steve, both agree that this is a rising trend in society. Specifically, you know.
And I don't mean to just pick on Trumpers. It's hugely rising all over.
Sure.
On both ends of the culture war spectrum, we are now forced in city hall meetings, you are now forced to use the term menstruating person, which is every bit as delusional as Carrie Lake saying that she can't run for vice president because she's governor of Arizona. That is every bit as delusional. Only women menstruate. And yet, half the people that you would meet in society, fully 100% of modern day American academia would say that I am not only delusional, but evil to say that. It's both ends of the spectrum. I'm not just suffering from, what was it, Trump delusion syndrome, Trump derangement syndrome. I'm not just saying that, because I myself 100% believe that Trump knows that he lost the election. I think that Carrie Lake knows too. Grifting is something I certainly can't accuse any of your guests of being part of, whether they mention quack health remedies on their channel or not. I don't believe that any of them are engaged in grifting. And I'm not saying that this isn't a cause for you in a search for, you know, the epistemology of why these people believe what they believe. I'm talking about the forward-facing element. Why would you put someone you know is fully delusional on camera for people to listen to?
Yeah, I don't think he's fully delusional. You know, I think there's a temptation to say that. I think he's fully wrong. Okay, we agree on the facts. I think he's fully wrong about there being sort of reptilian overlords and history not being correct. All these truth claims I agree are wrong, but I don't think it's fully delusional. I mean, let's take some examples. You know, the person on the street, the average person, the relative of many of the viewers that we have, you know, who say that yeah, Trump, the last election was rigged. You know, Trump didn't really lose. Is that delusional or is that just wrong? Like, where do you draw the line between delusional and wrong?
Delusion. I draw the line in definitions. You are delusional if you are believing something without any evidence, or if you're believing something to the contrary of incontrovertible factual evidence. In either of those cases, you are delusional. It's not, for me, vague at all. That person on the street who says, yeah, I think Trump won by a landslide.
So that's a fine way to use the term then. Okay, because I usually I interpret delusional as like being mentally ill, like having like a mental deficiency of some sort.
Not only.
Well, that's sort of, I've heard that as well though. I've heard people say you're bringing someone on who's clearly unwell mentally, and that's not what I believe.
No, that aspect, that particular shading of the word delusional certainly doesn't apply to Ellie.
Right.
It doesn't apply to many people that you brought on your channel. I imagine that's the product of careful vetting. But that's only one half of the definition. The other is if you know the facts and you refuse to believe them, you are then deluding yourself. You can still drive a car, you can still hold down a job, but you are still delusional.
Mm-hmm.
That person on the street who says, I think Trump won in a landslide, has certainly seen evidence to the contrary. It's been all over. Even if they just lock themselves into Fox News, they have certainly seen that. Evidence that is not true. Not just claims, but evidence that is not true.
So
choose to believe it anyway. That means they're deluding themselves.
So this is where you and I, we sort of part ways a little bit, because you are such a rational guy, Steve, and everyone knows you as like the rationalist par excellence. But my understanding of human
most of YouTube knows me as something else. That's nice of you to say.
My understanding of human beings and my understanding of human psychology and epistemology leads me to believe that in general, our beliefs are not really just the mathematical products of evidence that we sort of plug into the system, and that beliefs are very often just a vibe and very often just what feels right, and people who were really traumatized and heartbroken by Trump's loss have a belief, and it's a belief that, for example, I'll point the finger at myself. Let's talk about me. I'm very pro-immigration. Okay. Or for example, I'm very concerned about the plight of Palestinians, even though I was raised in a context where that was a fairly taboo thing to be concerned about. The reason I have these beliefs are not because evidence was sort of plugged into my calculator brain. It's just because I met certain people. Like, that's it. It's just a vibe. I just had certain life experiences, and that's where my beliefs come from. And some people might look at that as like being fairly irrational or delusional. But I think ultimately the trick, the key, the methodology of arriving at correct beliefs is having a wide expanse of life experience, and so I don't think of belief so much in terms of, they're delusional because they've seen evidence and they don't accept the evidence. I don't think that's just how human minds usually work when it comes to these conclusions.
You are completely wrong about your own example about yourself. So what does that do to your stance? You changed your opinion on the plight of the Palestinians because you looked into it, and the evidence of what you looked into changed your mind. Evidence, including the evidence from people that you talked to. But that wasn't just it. You did a whole bunch of reading. You did a whole bunch of watching the news. You gradually came to the moment. I bet you could identify the moment when you thought, this doesn't add up.
I'll tell you what it was. It was not what you think. I have read books and I have done a lot of research and watched a lot of documentaries and all that. But I think that if I were to point to a moment, it would be the time that I had a meal with a Palestinian kid in America. And I just talked to him about his experience,
That's still evidence. That's still evidence. You allowed the evidence to change your
evidence.
mind.
We call it evidence because it points me in the direction of truth. But if someone had a one-time meal with someone who told him, trust me, I saw the edge of the earth. I know the earth is round. And then he came to the conclusion that it was round. It would be a very similar scenario, but you wouldn't be like, that's evidence. You'd be like, that's a random anecdote from a stranger that's not worth anything. You know what I'm saying?
There's a difference, right? The Palestinian kid you were talking to was telling you about his own experiences. The other was relating hearsay. And let's leave aside for the moment the adorably Amy definition of evidence as that which points you towards the truth. Oh my, did that take me back to teaching freshmen. Oh my, that took me back. That's a talk for a whole nother time. Evidence is what comports with reality. Evidence is what can be duplicated, shown, tested, proven to be true. Your Palestinian friend's stories could certainly be verified. Your flat earther stories cannot be, and will be internally inconsistent even when he tells them, which is why you rejected them as evidence. In the reason you did that is because you did not ever construct for yourself the trapdoor, the get out of jail free card, the sudden bolt hole that a lot of your guests have constructed for themselves in their own personal reality, a way to preemptively falsify anything they don't want to hear. So that I had the spectacle of a grown man saying that a vaccine to combat a virus, a new virus, is all malarkey. You can watch it happen in a petri dish. Not that you can watch video footage. If you go to a lab, you can watch the reaction to the virus happen in a petri dish. Are you saying in that situation that the wavelengths of the visible light between the object in your eyes is being manipulated by lizard people? Or are you saying that the objects in the petri dish are artificial? No, there comes a point when you just have to say what you never did say, which is, yes, I'm on an epistemological search for how you got this way, but you're also wrong. You're also wrong. What is the ultimate good of bringing up the subject of whether or not the earth is round? Having someone say, no, it absolutely isn't, or I'm not really qualified to answer, and saying, well, these are important questions. Whether or not the earth is round is not at all an important question. It was 3,000 years ago when it was settled. It's not anymore. It hasn't been in 3,000 years. If it's an important question and it hasn't been settled, the first question would be, how are we having a Zoom call? That is all happening from satellites that are in orbit around a spherical world. And the answer will be, they want us to. That back door, that bolt hole is something you've never created for yourself, but you must have known people that were busily in the process of fireproofing their own delusions, right? You must have known young people that were busily constructing that bolt hole. I won't call it a priest hole. It used to be called a priest hole. But you knew people who were constructing that, and you didn't.
So Steve, so why? So to coming back, what's the value in platforming a flat earther, let's say? So a few things. So one is, I'm interested in these, what you called, I think, bolt holes. Yeah. I would have called it, circularity of arguments, what you call like an escape hatch. Those I find very interesting. I find it as well as I can, and it's not easy to do, and I don't claim to be great at it. What I'm trying to do, though, is find them and make them very visible. Like when I ask the 9/11 question and I say, were there airplanes? I want to make clear this hologram argument, because it's what you call a bolt hole or circularity. Like anything is now possible. You know what I'm saying? And I think shining light on that, I think, is helpful for the viewer potentially. And in private conversations could potentially be helpful to a particular interlocutor. It's helpful to me to sort of be aware of my own circularities, my own fallacious reasoning techniques. What are the ways in which I can construct, like you said, a escape hatch for any belief that I might hold. So that's one example of the kind of thing I'm looking for and trying to shine light on and make visible to people. The other big thing for me is, again, as I mentioned this before, but just to sort of spell it out a little bit more, is the trajectory of thought that leads a person from being what we'll call a normie to being far out and intellectually speaking. And I think that the train of thought, or sorry, the way in which these things happen is interesting. Different conversations reveal different patterns, but one pattern which I've seen in personal conversations, which is very interesting to me, is the way that for the reason of just random happenstance, probably related to trauma, someone gets a hook in their brain that 9/11 was an inside job. Maybe they saw it, they read in the news, they were traumatized, something. They just get it in their brain. They saw the documentary, the famous documentary on 9/11 that said it's an inside job, and now they're just 100% convinced. And because of the nature of human brains, we often don't think in like degradation of like degrees of confidence. We go between like 0 and 100. So now they're 100% confident. And if you find yourself at some point in life, for any reason, 100% confident that 9/11 is an inside job, suddenly you are now out of the orbit of like truth, because any media company that thinks 9/11 was not an inside job cannot be trusted. Any historical record, any report, any scientific organization, you start disqualifying as being invalid. And you find yourself what we call going down the rabbit hole of false, increasingly false beliefs and building up a parallel universe of thought. And to me, that pattern is very interesting. And it's a reminder of how important it is to stay in the orbit of good sources, And I think there's a lot of gray area. I reckon I specifically don't engage. I don't platform the gray, because I think platforming the gray is very dangerous. It's a risky thing, but there are lots of YouTube channels that I watch, some with 1 million+ subscribers, that will go into the COVID data from the perspective of a non-scientist and cherry pick papers and cherry pick stuff to cast all sorts of aspersions on the vaccines, to claim that the medical establishment is hiding increased mortality rates. And these are people who may have like some credentials. They seem very grounded in reality. It's very tempting gray area conspiratorial stuff. And I think there's just, ultimately a grounding we have to find. And like, what are the sources of people that we want to learn from? Do we want to learn from a random YouTuber who, maybe has a nursing background? Or do we want to like learn from, people who are, have a higher level of credential? Do we have a sense of like what is consensus among experts,
Okay, but when you platform somebody with unhinged beliefs, delusions, just in every direction, and you know already that they're really, really nice, that they're going to give off that impression to everybody, aren't you graying the waters when you do that?
Maybe. It's a good question. But I also think the other big thing there, that's really important, because you know what? I have loved ones who believe nonsense. I do. And they're nice people. I think one of the major lessons of World War II and the Holocaust, and a topic that I've, studied on this specifically interested, is the banality of evil, and, one of my favorite books of all time, I have a video on my channel, which I don't think was one of my best videos, but is a book that's one of my favorite books, is They Thought They Were Free, and about the Germans, the regular Nazis, and the fact that the author, a Jewish guy, befriends these people. He really likes them, these regular Nazis. And yeah, I think if there's one lesson to take away from these interviews, particularly, it's the banality of evil, that evil doesn't manifest, isn't self-consciously evil. And I think the mistake that conspiracy theorists make is they assume evil is self-consciously evil. They subscribe to the storybook kind of evil, a biblical evil, the devil, Milton Satan, what I'm saying? And if you think there's like Milton Satan, then anything is possible, Milton Satan could be pulling all the strings, and we really could be living in God's fishbowl and not know it, what I'm saying?
Genesis, Satan. If
yeah,
from
exactly.
Your interview, the book of Genesis, Satan, since your recent interview had it that there's serpent DNA.
Sure.
In some humans.
And to me, that's really important.
But if you would ask, is there primate DNA in some humans? The answer would be a resounding no. Absolutely not. So some DNA you're okay with, other DNAs no. You're okay with some people that you don't like being partially lizard, but if I ask you if you're a naked great ape, you'll say absolutely not. Absolutely not. But okay, fine. Maybe I'm just thinking of some of the people you've had on your channel that are admittedly extreme cases. They are not going to change their mind about anything. And they run the risk of changing other people's minds. I can't help but think that some of this boils down to an aspect of your own personality, not theirs. An aspect of your own personality in which you are a so-called seeker with a capital S. There's got to be an element of that.
I disagree.
Recognize it a mile off.
If someone reached out to me, if I felt that my video was promulgating the view that they're espousing, I would take it down. That's not what I want to do. And I try to be careful about it.
What view? What view?
The view that
I got into trouble reviewing the very book that produced the phrase "the banality of evil." I got into trouble for reviewing it because I said that lets the Nazis off the hook. Well, if reducing everything to just bland paperwork lets the Nazis off the hook, then how much does aliens controlling them let the Nazis off the hook? Yes, it's true that black and white comic book evil is rare, but it does exist. The Nazi upper echelon very consciously hid what they were doing, even in their own private documents. They hid what they were doing because they knew perfectly well it was evil. They knew perfectly well it was evil. They knew what would happen to them at some future Nuremberg. A lot of them were sick about it. A lot more of them than you typically read about shot themselves because of it. That was one of the maddening things about a whole bunch of interviews is that you've done, is that it tends to let the wrong people off the hook. even in the sanitized version that is the video that you just recently posted that I'm bashing all over because it got me infuriated. There are contradictions and lunacies everywhere in that talk, so big that you would think an intelligent man would trip over them even if he didn't want to. That all sources of intelligence, anything that you know, any venue of information is deeply suspect because they're involved in it, except for this admittedly anonymous online QAnon forum. That I trust. They are telling me the truth.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, might you admit that the sheer oddity of a Jewish QAnon member seemed like something you wanted to show people?
Yeah, definitely.
Was that some element of it that had?
Yeah,
I'm not
that's for sure.
Ellie to a circus freak, but
no, that I wouldn't say. That's not fair. I don't want to do that at all. No, that wouldn't be my goal.
There's an element of curiosity to that.
Yeah,
right? You edged around it yourself a few times in your conversation.
Yeah.
If Q told QAnon to kill every Jewish person they know, he would be dead by morning.
Okay. Yeah. So now I'm back from the break. I had to take a quick phone call. My apologies. Yeah, and we were discussing this interesting point of the what you've called the oddity of a Jewish QAnon, and to me, it's about the fact that these ideas are sufficiently persuasive that even to people who are really in the crosshairs of these ideas, they can have purchase and take root. And to me, that's very troubling and very disturbing. And yes, I would not say it's an oddity. I would not say it's certainly not to make fun of him at all. That's certainly not my intention. No. But no. I do feel it's less dangerous because I've talked to dangerous in a way, and dangerous in terms of the spread of the ideas. Because I've had interviews with non-Jewish people who've veered hard into anti-Semitism, and that's an unpleasant interview and an unpleasant experience that I'm not interested in publishing. But when you're talking to a Jewish person who you have that kind of familiarity, cultural familiarity, rapport with, there's a safety there that he's not going to veer into a hard kind of anti-Semitism that would make this conversation a lot less palatable to myself and most people.
Yeah, but QAnon is anti-Semitic.
It is.
It's
I agree 100%. I agree 100%.
But you know what fascinated me about that fact? Like I mentioned at the beginning of this poor torture session for Amy, I mentioned at the beginning that all of the parameters that he was using to describe this malevolent world, encompassing alien race thing, are exactly the parameters of anti-Semitism, exactly the descriptive parameters that anti-Semites use, exactly the same, except he had somebody else in the role of the Jews
because Khazarian mafia. It's like some subset of Jews,
right? Or the Khazarian mafia and these aliens,
right?
But always somebody else, always somebody pulling the strings with unseen but detectable authority. It's not the Matrix, because he's not catching one little glitch of a cat repeating itself. He knows everything about it, which no one in the Matrix does. It's not that. It's that it's the lumpen proletariat, the sheep, can't see it, but he can not only detect it, but know everything about it, enough to propound it and tell people to wake up, which is exactly what anti-Semites have been saying for 3,000 years. And you know what it made me think? You know what fascinated me about that moment? That confirmed a belief of mine. Oh my God! It confirmed a freestanding belief of mine. I have always believed that anti-Semitism is easy, that it's the easy handle that people put on a relatively insular group, but that it is only a handle and that the object, the thing behind it, is bigger. And that basically what I'm saying is that if anti-Semitism didn't exist, somebody would invent it.
Yeah.
It just so I have always thought that the Jewish people are just convenient.
Totally.
That's all. Totally. Just convenient. And that this massive thing of there must be more going on that I don't know about. There must be something out there that makes sense of it all. There must be something that confirms my status as both a truth-seeking maverick and a victim. There must be something like that out there that is totally nefarious and wants to stay hidden, but is easily identifiable if you know what to look for. How many times did that come up in the talk? If you know what to look for.
100%. Hannah Arendt. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I don't want to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, that's it. That fascinated me because
me too.
There is naked proof of that if ever you needed it. A Jewish man spouting what amounts to anti-Semitism only because it's never been anti-Semitism. Never. You get weirdos, people like that guy with a bullhorn that made the news last week, or Eric Dubé, the god priest of flat earth. You get people who make a case, or David Irving, for instance, a disgraced British historian. You get people who make a case justifying, okay, why is this the Jews? But it's actually not them at all. They're just handy. They're just
100%,
easy.
100%.
So.
And Hannah Arendt writes about that, I think, very beautifully and importantly in The Origins of Totalitarianism. There's a whole section in that book where she talks about, why were the Jews scapegoated? And she talks about their convenience as being identifiable, as being international, as having a high up place in society, as being, heavily overly represented in the finance system, as being sort of insular, right? Jewish people tend to be certainly then, and in many Jewish communities, there's an insularity of looking out for each other, and they're just incredibly useful as the stand-in for this nefarious force. Now, if you're Jewish and you can't use the Jews, well, then you create someone else. Okay, so then it could be an alien, or it could be whatever, some subset of Jews, the Khazarian Mafia, whatever. You find someone else to fill that role. But that's the point. You need someone which is like this widespread, invisible, but also identifiable network of collaborators, and that's ultimately what you need to sort of fill in the gaps of this, all-powerful, but also potentially invisible force manipulating all of society. Yeah.
Right. The Khazarian Mafia. Right. And I want to say, prove it. Don't tell me how sure you are. Don't tell me how many good interactions you have with its source. Prove it. Prove that it even exists. That would be a fine place to start. Prove that it even exists. And by proof, I mean put 10 pieces of evidence in a box and ship it across the world to somebody else and have them come to the conclusion, I've thought about this. I've put these all together. It's been 2 months now. I've neglected my family and friends, but I've determined that it is the Khazarian Mafia. No one will do that.
So that's a valid line of questioning. It's different than the one I would use, because I think it's perfectly interesting and valid and fruitful. I had no problem with it. But I think of the inconsistency in finding these people. Like how would you know? Is my instinct. How would you determine if someone is the right kind or the wrong kind of Jew? Like what are the telltale factors? Who can you point to in practice, and like trying to find those edges. So another example, this came up around doctors. I don't know if you caught this. I think most people must have missed it because he said it in passing. He said in passing, he has friends who are doctors. He said in passing, like, I know people who are doctors. Doctors are fine. I have no problem with doctors, but it's a medical establishment. So it's like, where do you draw that line? When does a doctor go from being a doctor that you're cool with to being part of the medical establishment, Yeah. And that to me is what's sort of the fascinating inquiry into like figuring out how he wrestles with those boundaries,
Right. And it's the same problem that flat earthers have. Because if you have that question about doctors, then you have that question about nurses, pharmacists, dentists, veterinarians.
Of course.
All in on it? Are they all in on it? And if they aren't all in on it, are they all duped? No matter how many Nobel Prizes they have, are they all duped? You're not duped. One guy with a YouTube channel, but they are, all of them. So they're either all duped or they're all in on it. And flat earthers run into the same thing. How many people are involved in some way or another with some aspect of science that is absolutely dependent on the fact that Earth is an oblate spheroid? Yeah. Hundreds of millions.
Well, every map, if Earth is not an oblate spheroid, then we don't have a map. Then you don't know the distance between any two countries, right? And that means that any computer programmer who cares about the latency from their network to their client has no way to know the distance between their network, their servers and their clients.
And if you pin one of them on that, they will say, we do have a map. And you will say, all right, well, if you have a map, then apply a foot scale to it and make some measurements. Because I can walk from here to Falmouth.
Many flat earthers will tell me they don't have a map.
Without any chance at all of falsity, that the distance between here and Falmouth.
Right.
On your map, it won't be true.
Correct.
You can't give it a scale that will work. And what do they say? Well, it would work if they let it.
Right. Okay, yeah. One last piece, though. Go ahead. I don't want to cut you off. Go ahead. You're saying something? Okay.
No. I'm perfectly happy to go on and on.
One last piece, which I think is really important, though, and something I always try to expose in these conversations, but didn't really come up so much with this most recent one. But to me is very important, is the way in which I think a lot of conspiracy theories are downstream of politics, and specifically downstream of a very particularly violent, fascistic kind of politics. And I think a way to think about that is like the belief that the last election was false. You and I agree is like not based on evidence, it's irrational, whatever, but it's rooted in a sense of feeling very disappointed in the outcome of the election. It's rooted in a sense that if enough people believe that the last election was false, was illegitimate, then there's a real chance that we can like overturn democracy. We can undermine democracy in a very nefarious way. You know, there's a political motive to these things. Similarly, right. In the flat Earth case, it's that to such an extreme. If you think that everyone is lying to you, that you are part of the select few, you know, priests who, like in the Matrix, that know the actual truth. There's a deep, violent, bloodthirsty, revolutionary fervor and energy that underpins all of that. If you believe that 9/11 was an inside job, there's no amount of violence that isn't, you know, called for in retribution for that. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's just another, you know, key element. You know, we're talking about the banality of evil, talking about, you know, where these ideas lead and where they come from. There's a real strong political, violent bend to these ideas that I try to get at and expose as much as possible.
That's what fascinated me about that last talk of yours, because all three of those things you mentioned that Trump won in 2020, all three of flat Earth, all three of the things you mentioned boil down to anti-Semitism. When you get all the way to the bottom floor of all of those delusions, you will get someone who says to you, they don't want the truth to be known, and the they is always the same. Except in your case, except in Eli's case, where he has transported the they one galaxy over, because it can't be. If it's the they that all those other delusions think, then he's in on it, and he would know that he's in on it, and he knows that he's not. So, you know, but ultimately, because I think for your interview with him anyway demonstrates to me that I have always been right, and that Hannah Arendt was right, that the Jews have just been a handy expression of that much broader belief that someone is doing me wrong.
Yeah.
Someone is making the world rotten behind the scenes. I see just enough pieces to get me going, but I don't see the whole picture, and most people don't see any of it. And I think that ultimately behind that belief is the problem. Well, I'm sure it didn't escape you when I was talking about the Khazarian mafia. I said, what I want you to be able to do is pick 8 pieces of proof for your idea, put them in a box and mail them to the other side of the world. Someone who hasn't heard this conversation, doesn't know anything about what we're talking about, and ask them to, what do you make of this? And if you have 8 pieces of proof, they will put them together and they will say it's the Khazarian mafia. And that will never, ever happen. That will never happen. And I'm sure it didn't escape your notice that that's true of religion as well. All religions that have ever been, all religions that are now. And I wonder if that isn't ultimately the thing that's causing this problem, that isn't ultimately fomenting a persistent generational belief in the unseen. And I don't know what to do about that. I don't know that we're going to be able to settle what to do about that. Oh, dead silence.
At the top, listen, I don't share that belief. I mean, I hear what you're saying. I share the belief that you can't prove religion. I don't tend to scapegoat religion as the source of evils, although I see the argument, you know, obviously, you know, if someone makes the argument that there's a slippery slope between believing in a code of law and a Bible that implies a brief, what's it called? Like a young earth creationism. Yeah. I hear it.
Creationism comes explicitly from the Bible.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I hear it. It doesn't accord with my understanding of where these beliefs come from, though. I mean, to my understanding, these beliefs are often much more downstream of political incentives.
I'm not meaning, I'm certainly not meaning to make religion the hobby horse here. But if what you hear from most of your out there guests when you have these talks of yours is not religion, then what is it? And that is the singular vulnerability of religion, which is
these guys. I know
my
these
bumper
people,
sticker slogan: "Show me your goblin." If you're going to say that your goblin exists, show it to me.
Some of these people are new age spiritual. You know, you have these people who believe in crystals and they believe in all sorts of wild conspiracy theories, and they don't believe in a God. They don't believe in any Old Testament or anything like that. They just believe in sort of spiritual energy forces and auras and all these things, and that can also lead to all sorts of bad,
So you say.
conspiratorial nonsense.
Have you ever found an example where that is literally true? I never have. I've known lots of people who believe in spirituality and crystals, and you only have to talk to them for 5 minutes until they mention angels. Well, where do angels come from? And then you press them a little on the angels, and well, maybe there is a guiding spirit in the universe. Okay, well, is it 100? The Hindus say it's 100. Is it 100 guiding spirit? Oh, no, definitely not. No. More like, I don't know, 1 or at most 3.
So what's your hobby horse then? Okay, this is interesting. So I'm learning from you now that it's not so much, because I originally was assuming that your concern was the biblical text, like an ancient text that was filled with misinformation or filled with violent injunctions as being the source of the issue. But you're saying it's really just the belief in a theology.
Well, ultimately, I guarantee you, once they mention angels, they're talking about a guiding force in the universe. I guarantee you, when you get them talking about that and ask them, so does it have the head of a hippo? They'll say, absolutely not. Absolutely not. 1 million people believed that exact thing for 1,000 years. But they'll say, absolutely not. And the hobby horse that I'm getting at here is that none of it is real. What we mean by real is you can put 8 pieces of evidence in a box and ship it on the other side of the world. But none of it is real.
We have to get Tom of LA Books on here to do a rebuttal.
Well, I'm not saying that the effects on a person's life of believing this stuff aren't real, but the stuff itself is not real. I like to make that distinction because religious people think I'm attacking their faith, and I'm not. But their faith is self-contradictory. The New Testament tells us over and over and over again that the living word of God will be written on the hearts of all people. No nation has ever spontaneously generated Christianity. No nation ever will. Get rid of it today, it'll never regrow. Same thing with any religion. It's something totally different would replace it. Something totally different is replacing it right now in America. About 20 million of those 160 million people believe that Donald Trump is not human.
Yeah, again, to me, though, fascism and bad politics, this is my main point. Fascism and bad politics can take root among atheists as well. And that's really what I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about fascism. I'm concerned about illiberalism, which is to say anti-democratic sentiments. I'm concerned about conspiratorial thinking and violence. And in my experience, in my understanding of human brains, that is as appealing and as dangerous to atheists as it is to religious people. That's my bias. That's my prior coming into this conversation.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is the DNA at the base of all of it. You say fascism can take root among atheists, sure. But the lower rungs and the higher rungs, the Jared Kushners of any kind of fascist regime, are going to say that the dear leader is basically without error, which is a supernatural belief. They don't know anyone who's ever without error. They've never met anyone or heard about anyone who's without error. They're making an insular supernatural claim for one person.
Right.
Ultimately, that authority cannot be questioned in any temporal way. And I've always thought, I hate to agree with Christian religions here, but I've always thought that is religion.
So then reverse the causality. So instead of saying that religion causes bad things, say that the sort of psychological mechanisms that lead people to venerate ideologues is the same psychological mechanism that leads people to become religious. That's all.
Right. And I'd love to know what that is. That's what I was trying. That was the point I was trying to get at with this whole, someone just spending an hour describing anti-Semitism in every one of its warpings. But then when you get down to the kernel, it's not the Jews, it's aliens. That struck me as absolutely fascinating. That proves to me just what you're saying here, that there's a deeper urge in the human psyche that just looks for ways to do it, looks for exponents to give it. And I think that could be easily rooted out if people would just remember that there is no truth with a capital T. There's especially no wisdom with a capital W. It'd be really nice if people could remember that. There is no supernatural. Stop. Full stop. There is no supernatural. There is nothing that is supernatural. There is no supernatural. All of this stuff is pinned on it. Absolutely pinned on the supernatural. Sooner or later, you get to the supernatural. I guess humans are probably wired to think that way. You will have to get Tom on LA Books on here and just talk it all out with you.
So that's your sort of I guess, main takeaway, and I value that and I appreciate that. I have a different main takeaway I would want to leave the audience with after our conversation, and I think it's actually a point of contention between us, which we never fully flushed out. But my understanding of human beings and human psychology and human epistemology is that no one thinks alone. And what I mean by that is that I think the key hallmark of a conspiracy theorist is this insistence on show me the evidence so I could see it. I won't believe the earth is round unless I can see the earth being round. In reality, all evidence is contextual evidence. If you put in your box of 8 proofs of the antiquity of the earth, a fossil, you also have to put in the box the tools that we use to date that fossil, information about exactly how that fossil was found and the record of who traced, what evidence was it tampered with, who could be, all the known manufacturing techniques. We're moving into an age now, Steve, of generative AI, where you can type in a phrase and get an image that matches that phrase. It's brand new, never been seen before, but looks like a photo. So we've had Photoshop for a long time. Photos and videos can be doctored. What our eyes, the video record is not what it used to be. The images are not as compelling as they used to be. Ultimately, we have to recognize that we think in collaboration, and we should be collaborating with people who are trustworthy and honest and have the interest of truth in mind. So, the scientific community progresses and advances because there's a collaboration between experts who are sharing knowledge and they rely on each other and trust each other. There's checks and balances, and there's peer review, and there's reproducing of results and things like that. And so it's sort of identifying these reliable networks of information, trying to lean on those, and not fall out of their orbit into unreliable networks of information.
What happened to your search for the truth? You were the one that brought that sophomore year thing up. I didn't bring that up. Now all of a sudden it's gone. Truth is not a product of consensus at all. Yes, no one thinks alone. But if I take a healthy piece of tissue in a petri dish and I show it to someone who has never looked through a microscope before, has never seen healthy tissue, and I say, this is healthy tissue, and I can prove it. I can show you examples of unhealthy tissue. I can show you that I'm taking this piece of tissue from my own arm and putting it here. You can watch the whole thing in person and see. Now I'm going to introduce a chemo drug. I want you to see what it does. Let's say I show you a tumor. Here's a vial. It's got a little bit of erythromycin in it. I'm going to introduce it into this petri dish. I want you to watch through the microscope what happens. I do not have to stand there and say, now I will indoctrinate you. The person will look through the microscope and say, Steve, what you just injected killed the thing I'm looking at.
How many things can you inject that will kill the thing that you just looked at, but will also be damaging to the body much more than chemo is? I mean, obviously chemo is damaging to the body.
Maybe later on I tell them that, yeah, this is also damaging to the body. Maybe they can look and see. It looked to me like it drastically shrunk the bad part, but it also hurt the good part. And I could say, well, now that you've seen that, I can tell you that you're right. But I won't need to tell them that's what's happening. I won't need to interpret anything with any kind of exegesis. They'll be able to watch it.
It's a very unusual case. It's a perfectly fine case. That's a valid case. When it comes to something like round Earth, I think that most people don't have any direct evidence that the Earth is round. They just don't. And it comes down to trusting experts, trusting our maps, trusting the people that say they went to space. So I think that's an unusual case.
People have their eyes. They can see.
The Earth looks flat. The horizon looks flat.
The Earth most certainly does not look flat. This standard example is that a ship disappears bottom first over a horizon. That is a standard example. That was an example that was used 2,000 years ago. It must be going down a hill. It's the exact same visual phenomenon. Well, the water's not on a hill. It means that the water is the hill. You can see the curve of the Earth on a lunar eclipse. If you're going to say that's a flat plate, well, then how does the sun come between the moon and the Earth for a solar eclipse? People have been figuring these things out with their eyes, without hearsay, for thousands of years. That was long before Galileo actually saw globes revolving around a globe other than our own globe. And I understand when you say him, you're saying, well, you're reading about this, but you can buy a telescope and see what he saw. You can see it in 100 times better detail for $80. And I have talked to flat Earth people who say, well, they get to the telescopes You know, they manufacture the telescope. So they have to find a point in the sequence that is not your own direct observation. They can easily do it. That strikes me as really weird. I mean, if you were part of the do your own research crowd and you took it to extremes, you could ground your own lens and make your own telescope. There are instruction videos on YouTube. And make a telescope that is at least as strong as the Galilean telescope to show you the moons of Jupiter.
Okay, but you can't do it for quantum mechanics. You can't do it for general relativity. You're going to hit a point when you can't do it. And if the same problem stands, you know, I believe uncertainty in quantum mechanics is a valid mental model, is a valid mathematical model for describing all sorts of phenomena in our universe. And it's not because I've seen it with my own eyes. I haven't. Same thing with general relativity.
Well, no, but that's the whole point of when scientists always stress that in addition to all the data, science must also make predictions. That's why they're saying that, because a prediction will be discovered to be true by someone who isn't in the room, someone who doesn't know the eschatology, someone who will figure it out on their own and demonstrate that it's true. And that's happened thousands of times in thousands of different experiments for both quantum mechanics and the general theory of relativity. So you don't have to. I know what you're saying. You don't have to see those experiments. It's possible to see them. There are versions of both those fields of study that have directly observable experiments. But the experts that have confirmed a lot of the predictions were not present when the predictions were made.
Sure. I mean,
it doesn't matter whatsoever. And as so many people have pointed out, they would win every Nobel Prize in the world if they proved it wrong.
Right. What are some closing thoughts to leave the audience with? This was a wide-ranging conversation. I think you gave me a lot of good things to think about. I think you gave me and the audience also some very valid criticisms, pushback, which to my process, which I think I should consider and the audience should consider, and you know, should inform my decisions going forward. What can you leave us with today, though?
Well, just that. I mean, your brain is recording memories right from the beginning, literally from birth. In fact, before birth, your brain, the neural links in your brain are well able to encode memories right at birth, at least at birth. You are encoding all of those memories, but there's another layer to your brain that develops later, and that is sort of what used to be the library card catalog. Now we can think of it as Google, which is the neural pathways where you access those memories. And those get coded over, they get plaqued over with all sorts of myelin that helps you in some ways, hurts you in others, so that by the time you reach your 20s or your 30s, you have that system in place. But the memories are still there, right? As we know, if you've read Proust, for instance, he accesses a whole world of memories by an unexpected sensory note. Same thing with people who always say, I had a smell that I haven't smelled in so long, and it made me remember all kinds of things that I hadn't remembered. Those memories are there. My final thought would be, the memories that you aren't accessing are memories of what? They are memories of you being a small child who is increasingly aware that all around him are mysterious authority figures and a gigantic webwork of information that they don't understand, but they keep bumping up against it. I have no idea why I was yelled at when I went near such and such, but I was, and I consistently am. There must be a web of reasons why that is true. You get those memories and those associations, but by the time you're in your 20s and 30s, you don't remember them anymore. You could, I guess, access them if you were traumatized in some way. Maybe it's possible that a neurologist could excite those parts of your mind and bring those memories. Some people undergoing minor brain surgery do record that all of a sudden they're right there in memories that they hadn't accessed in forever, but the memories are still there. And those memories give rise to, they make it very comfortable as an adult to believe in conspiratorial nonsense. They make it very comfortable as an adult to believe in the Matrix, because what little 2-year-old bouncing around the house that they don't understand, nothing in it they understand, what little 2-year-old isn't living in the Matrix? Those memories, the memories of a world in which it makes sense that so much is hidden from you, but still real, and that everything that's happening to you is the result of manipulation. Of course, a child would look at the world that way. That is true for a child. Though the comfort of that web of pre-memories, if we want to call it that, should be suspected. by adults. If you find yourself easing into a web of nonsense, none of which can be proven, because it echoes that web, those pre-memories, you should suspect that. You should demand proof, is what I'm saying.
I wanted to give you the last word. Go ahead, yeah?
That's it. That's all.
I wanted to give you the last word, but as you were talking, I had a thought also. So this is the problem with our conversations. They just rabbit holes. They just go on forever and ever.
Someday it will be in person. We will go on forever.
I have a thought that I want to end with also, and you can have the last word again when I'm done.
No, it's your show. You can have.
I think things will be as controversial as some other things that I've said. So, which is a good thing, because then we'd really never end. But I think it's worth when I talk to conspiracy theorists, one of the things I think about is that I think there are real evidence-based conspiracies that are in our world today. Edward Snowden revealed that there's government surveillance going on at a level that was not known by the public. And he revealed that. You can read about senators and congressmen and women profiting off of stock trades in obscene amounts, and that's a pure conspiracy of the wealthiest.
9/11.
Politically, yeah.
There are plenty of unanswered questions about 9/11. I don't.
Well, that's not what I'm thinking of specifically, though. That's a different kind. But listen, that's where we get into the territory where we don't necessarily see eye to eye. But I think on this, at least we could still fully agree, which is just the fact that in the COVID relief programs, there was a tremendous amount of grift, just a tremendous amount of people who were politically connected, making off with billions of dollars. The economy, we know the New York Times and so many good journalists have done work on this. The economy works so well for the top few percent of Americans and does not work for everyone else. These are just reality that's supported by evidence and good research and good journalism. Yeah, you don't need to. I think a lot of the bad conspiracies are sort of from people who smell the issues, smell some of these noxious behaviors and real conspiracies, and don't know what to do with it. I think often Republicans are more susceptible because they can't. It sort of doesn't accord with their political dogma, so to speak. And so they don't know what to do with that feeling and what to do with those. So I think I would say that, yeah, there are bad conspiracies, but those are a distraction from the real conspiracies. This element of sort of keep your eye on the ball when it comes to these things. And the other last piece, which is on my mind as we're closing, is that I think human beings often fail to appreciate the importance of democracy and the importance of playing the long game. And even if your team loses an election, to not blow up the system. And I think because democracy has worked so well for us, it's very easy to just say throw it out. But if you learn history and you learn reality, democracy that we have with all its warts and all its flaws, and God knows it doesn't work well for many, many, many millions of people. And God knows that there's deep poverty in America, and there's obscenities related to our healthcare system and mental health system and homelessness and on and on and on. With all those problems, the alternative of throwing out democracy in favor of something much more totalitarian and fascistic is actually much worse. So those are my two closing thoughts here.
I agree completely. Like everybody else, when I was acquainted with the full-blown Nazi bug, Nick Fuentes, and the clip on one of his own shows that he films literally in his mother's basement was shown over and over again on mainstream media about him saying that's why we need a dictatorship. And all I wanted to do was say, how would you feel about a Kamala Harris dictatorship? Once you create the dictatorship, you've created the dictatorship. You don't have control over who's going to be in it. Do you think it's going to be your guy forever or your guys? No, that's not true at all. We can end on in other words, we can end on a note of complete agreement.
I wanted to. That was my goal. Wonderful. Steve, this has been so much fun. I always do this. Every time we have these conversations, I'm reminded of how valuable they are to me and why I appreciate them so much.